There are places in this world where darkness doesn't just fall. It seeps, it crawls, it takes root and refuses to leave. You think you know what fear is until you're alone with nothing but fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby above your head, and something is watching you through screens that should only show empty hallways. Tonight, I'm going to share 3 stories that came directly from the depths of Reddit's darkest corners. Tales so disturbing that they've haunted the internet for years. Stories that will make you question every shadow, every creak, every moment when you think you're truly alone. These aren't just campfire tales or urban legends. These are real experiences from real people who lived through absolute terror and somehow survived to tell about it. The first story takes us into the bowels of a corporate building where a security guard discovered that some jobs come with more than just a paycheck. But before we descend into that nightmare, if you're brave enough to join me on this journey through humanity's darkest encounters, consider subscribing to this channel. After all, misery loves company, and the darkness is always less frightening when shared. Here's a question that might chill your bones. What do you do when the thing you're hired to watch out for is already inside, watching you? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now, and what time is it where you are? Are you alone in the dark, or do you have the comfort of others nearby? Because after tonight's stories, you might never feel truly alone again. Marcus Thompson thought he'd found the perfect job when he answered that Craigslist ad for overnight security at the Whitmore office complex downtown, a towering glass monument to corporate success that had been mostly empty for the past 6 months after the company that built it went bankrupt, leaving behind nothing but empty cubicles, abandoned conference rooms, and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The pay was surprisingly good for what seemed like easy work. Just walk the rounds every 2 hours, keep an eye on the security monitors, and make sure nobody tried to break in or vandalize the property while it sat waiting for new tenants. Marcus had been unemployed for 3 months after getting laid off from his factory job, and this night shift position seemed like a godsend, especially since it meant he could look for other work during the day and still have money coming in. The building manager, a nervous little man named Peterson who seemed eager to get the keys handed over and disappear, gave him a quick tour on his first evening, showing him the security office in the basement, the monitor bank with feeds from 32 cameras scattered throughout the building's 12 floors, and the route he should take during his hourly rounds. Peterson mentioned almost offhandedly that the previous security guard had quit without notice after just 1 week. But people quit jobs all the time, especially boring overnight positions where nothing ever happened, so Marcus didn't think much of it. What Peterson didn't mention, and what Marcus wouldn't discover until he was already locked in for his first 8-hour shift, was that the building's silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty office space. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of something holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. The first sign that something was wrong came when Marcus settled into the security office around midnight and started going through the previous guard's belongings that had been left behind in the desk drawers. Most night shift workers left something behind: coffee cups, magazines, maybe a sweater for cold nights, but what Marcus found painted a picture of increasing paranoia and fear. There were pages of handwritten notes scattered throughout the drawers, scrawled observations about strange sounds, elevator movements, and camera malfunctions that seemed to follow a disturbing pattern. The notes started normally enough in the first week: routine observations about checking doors, testing alarms, noting which lights were left on. But by the second week, the handwriting became more erratic and the content more unsettling. Building. Seems to breathe at night. One entry read, sounds like air moving through vents, but HVAC system is shut off. Another note, dated just 3 days before the guard quit, simply said, Camera 12 keeps showing movement, but when I check floor 8 northeast, corner nothing there, checked 5 times tonight, something is wrong with that camera or something is wrong with that corner. The maintenance logs told an even stranger story when Marcus dug deeper into the filing cabinet. Over the past year, there had been dozens of service calls to the 8th floor, always for the same issues: elevators stopping on that floor without being called, motion sensors triggering in empty areas, and temperature fluctuations in the northeast corner where camera 12 was positioned. 3 different maintenance crews had been called out to investigate, and each time they found nothing wrong with the equipment, no signs of malfunction or tampering, but the problems persisted. The building's architectural plans, which Peterson had left in case of emergency, showed something interesting about that 8th floor corner. It had been modified during construction, walled off from what was originally supposed to be a larger, open office space, creating a smaller enclosed area that wasn't visible from any of the windows and could only be accessed through a service corridor that was supposed to be kept locked. Marcus made a note to check that corridor during his first round, figuring that maybe someone had found a way to break in through a service entrance or maintenance access. But as he sat there reading through months of increasingly disturbing reports from previous guards, maintenance workers, and even daytime cleaning staff, he began to understand why Peterson had seemed so eager to hand over the keys and leave. The building wasn't just empty. According to these reports, it had never really been empty, not even during the day when it was fully occupied by the company that built it, and whatever was sharing the space with the human occupants had become much more active since most of the people left. At 2 a.m., Marcus began his first patrol route, flashlight in hand even though the emergency lighting kept most hallways dimly visible, and that's when he first heard the footsteps above him. He was on the 3rd floor, checking door locks and testing motion sensors, when the sound started. A slow, deliberate walking pattern coming from somewhere directly overhead, which should have been the 4th floor. The footsteps weren't hurried, or panicked like someone trying to hide. They were measured, purposeful, as if someone was pacing back and forth in a regular pattern, and they seemed to follow Marcus as he moved through the 3rd floor corridor. When Marcus stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped. When he started walking again, they resumed, always staying directly above his position. His first thought was that someone had indeed broken into the building, but when he checked the 4th floor, he found all the doors locked, no signs of forced entry, and no one in any of the offices or conference rooms. The footsteps had stopped completely by the time he reached the 4th floor, but as soon as he returned to the 3rd floor to continue his patrol, they started again, same measured pace, same positioning directly overhead. This pattern continued for the next hour. Every time Marcus was on floors 1 through 11, he could hear someone walking on the floor directly above him. But whenever he investigated the source floor, he found nothing but empty offices and locked doors. The strangest part was the 12th floor, the top level of the building, because when Marcus was checking the 11th floor, he could hear footsteps above him coming from the 12th floor, but the 12th floor was supposed to be mechanically sealed. No tenant access, just HVAC equipment and building maintenance systems that required special elevator access codes that Marcus didn't have. When he returned to the security office and checked the camera feeds, he saw nothing unusual on any of the floors, just empty hallways and dark offices, but camera 12, the one that monitored the 8th floor northeast corner, was showing something that made his blood run cold. There was a shadow in that corner, a human-shaped silhouette that wasn't quite solid enough to be a person but too defined to be a trick of the light, and it was standing perfectly still, facing the camera directly, as if it knew Marcus was watching and wanted to be seen. Marcus tried switching to other camera feeds and then back to camera 12, thinking it might be a technical glitch, but the shadow remained, and over the next 20 minutes he watched it slowly move closer to the camera, not walking, but somehow flowing across the floor like liquid darkness taking human form. By 4 a.m., Marcus had abandoned any pretense of following his patrol route and was glued to the monitor bank, watching camera 12 with a mixture of fascination and growing terror as the shadow figure continued its slow approach toward the camera. Position. The other monitors showed the building exactly as it should be, empty, quiet, undisturbed, but camera 12 had become a window into something else entirely, a view of the same 8th floor corner where something impossible was happening, in real time. The shadow had features now, or at least the suggestion of features. A head, shoulders, arms that swayed slightly as it moved, and, most disturbing of all, what appeared to be eyes that reflected the camera's infrared illumination like an animal's, eyes caught in headlights. Marcus had tried calling Peterson multiple times, but the calls went straight to voicemail, and he was beginning to understand why the building manager had been so eager to leave and why the previous security guard had quit without notice. The maintenance logs made sense now. The elevator stopping on the 8th floor wasn't a malfunction, it was responding to someone or something calling it, and the motion sensors weren't triggering randomly, they were detecting movement that the cameras couldn't properly capture except for this one feed that seemed to exist in some space between what was real and what should be impossible. Around 4:30 a.m., the elevator started moving on its own, and Marcus watched the floor indicator lights show it traveling from the ground floor to the 8th floor, stopping there for exactly 3 minutes, then continuing to the 12th floor, where it stayed for nearly 10 minutes before returning to the ground floor. During those 10 minutes, the footsteps above Marcus's head became more pronounced. Not just walking now, but what sounded like furniture being moved, doors being opened and closed, and at one point, what could only be described as multiple voices, having a conversation in words that didn't sound quite human. Camera 12 showed the shadow figure had reached the camera position and was now standing directly beneath it, looking up into the lens with those reflective eyes, and Marcus realized with absolute certainty that whatever this thing was, it knew exactly where he was sitting in the basement security office. It knew he was watching, and it was done hiding. The building's silence was broken by the sound of every elevator in the complex activating simultaneously, all of them moving toward the ground floor, and Marcus understood that his 8-hour shift was about to become a fight for survival against something that had been waiting patiently for months to have the building entirely to itself, with only one terrified night watchman standing between it and complete dominion over 12 floors of darkness. The elevators reached the ground floor at exactly 5 a.m., and Marcus could hear their doors opening in perfect synchronization, followed by the sound of footsteps, not one set but many, spreading throughout the building like water finding every possible path through a cracked foundation. Camera 12 went dark, showing nothing but static, but the other monitors revealed glimpses of movement that shouldn't have been possible. Shadows flowing through doorways, elevator doors closing on empty cars that somehow contained human-shaped silhouettes, and on the stairwell cameras, what appeared to be people walking downward but leaving no footprints and casting no shadows of their own. Marcus tried to call 911, but his cell phone showed no signal, and when he picked up the landline in the security office, there was no dial tone, just a soft breathing sound that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. The building's emergency systems should have activated. Motion sensors, alarm panels, automatic calls to the security company, but everything remained silent except for the approaching footsteps that were now clearly audible in the basement corridor outside the security office. Marcus realized his only chance was to barricade himself in the office and wait for sunrise, hoping that whatever these things were, they were bound by the same ancient rules that kept most nightmares confined to the dark hours before dawn. He pushed filing cabinets against the door, unplugged the monitors except for the few cameras that still showed normal views of empty hallways, and huddled in the corner with his flashlight turned off, listening to what sounded like a dozen people, walking slowly up and down the corridor outside, testing door handles, whispering to each other in voices that rose and fell like wind through broken windows. The whispers weren't in any language Marcus recognized, but somehow he understood their meaning. They were talking about him, discussing what to do with the living person who had intruded on their domain, debating whether to let him leave at sunrise or add him to their collection of previous guards, maintenance workers, and daytime employees who had disappeared over the months since the building had been mostly abandoned. At 6:47 a.m., just as the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the basement windows, the whispers stopped, the footsteps faded, and Marcus heard the elevators moving again, this time carrying their passengers back to whatever floors they called home. When Peterson arrived at 8 a.m. to check on Marcus's first night, he found the security office empty except for a resignation letter on the desk and all 32 monitors showing the same image. Camera 12's view of the 8th floor corner, where a shadow figure stood perfectly still, facing the camera, waiting for the next person brave enough or desperate enough to take the night shift job that was still posted on Craigslist, still offering surprisingly good pay for what seemed like easy work. The Henderson family thought they had found their dream home when they purchased the colonial-style house on Maple Street for $30,000 below market value, a steal that their realtor explained away as motivated sellers who needed to relocate quickly for work. But dreams can quickly become nightmares when you discover that your new home already has a tenant who never signed a lease and has no intention of leaving. David and Sarah Henderson, along with their 2 young children, moved in on a bright Saturday morning in October, spending the weekend unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, completely unaware that someone was watching their every move from the hidden spaces beneath their feet. The first signs were subtle. Food disappearing from the refrigerator in small amounts that could easily be attributed to the chaos of moving, the children eating more snacks than usual, or simple miscounting. When grocery shopping, a loaf of bread that should have lasted the week was gone by Wednesday. Milk that was nearly full on Sunday was empty by Tuesday morning, and Sarah noticed that items in the pantry seemed to be rearranging themselves, with canned goods moved. To different shelves and boxes of cereal rotated in ways that didn't match how she remembered putting them away. David dismissed these concerns as moving stress and the adjustment period that came with living in a new house, but by the second week, the signs became harder to ignore. The house had strange smells that seemed to come from the ventilation system. Not the musty odor of an old house or the chemical scents left behind by previous occupants, but human smells, the kind that suggested someone who hadn't bathed in weeks and was living on a diet of processed foods and desperation. There were sounds, too, subtle creaking and settling noises that happened at odd times, usually during the day when the family was out at work and school, sounds that the neighbors later admitted they had heard for months before the Hendersons. Moved in, but had assumed were just normal house noises from a property that had been empty for 6 months. What the neighbors didn't know, and what the Hendersons wouldn't discover for another 2 weeks, was that the house had never really been empty. The previous owners had moved out, but someone else had moved in, someone who had been studying the house's routines, learning the family's schedules, and preparing for the day when new occupants would provide him with entertainment, food, and the thrill of living invisibly among people who had no idea they were sharing their most intimate spaces with a stranger. The evidence became undeniable when Sarah started finding things that definitely didn't belong to their family. A toothbrush with bristles worn down from months of use hidden behind the water heater, food wrappers stuffed into heating vents, and most disturbing of all, a small collection of their family photographs that had been taken from various rooms throughout the house and were discovered tucked behind the basement's false ceiling panels, along with what appeared to be handwritten notes documenting their daily routines. The notes were detailed and obsessive, tracking when each family member left for work or school, what they ate for breakfast, what television shows they watched, even noting personal conversations that could only have been overheard by someone hiding very close to the family's living spaces. David found clothing that wasn't his in the basement crawl space. Dirty jeans, several worn t-shirts, underwear, and socks that reeked of someone who had been living rough for an extended period. And when he followed the trail of personal belongings deeper into the crawl space, he discovered a nest-like arrangement of blankets and pillows that had clearly been used as a sleeping area for weeks or possibly months. The most chilling discovery was a notebook filled with detailed observations about their family dynamics, including Sarah's work schedule at the hospital, the children's after-school activities, David's habit of staying up late watching television, and disturbingly specific notes about the family's security practices, like which doors they locked at night, whether they set the alarm system, and which windows they left open during warm evenings. The handwriting was erratic but legible, switching between careful documentation and what appeared to be increasingly unhinged rambling about becoming part of the family, about how comfortable he had become living in their house, and about his growing resentment that they had intruded on his peaceful existence by moving into what he now considered his home. There were sketches in the margins of the notebook, crude drawings of the house's layout with detailed notes about hiding spots, escape routes, and vantage points for observation. And several pages contained what could only be described as fantasy scenarios where he interacted with the family members, sometimes as a helpful presence they never noticed, other times as something much more sinister. Sarah wanted to call the police immediately, but David convinced her they needed more evidence, that they should set up cameras to catch this person in the act so the authorities would take their situation seriously, not realizing that their uninvited basement tenant had been planning for this possibility and had already identified every entrance and exit to the house, every hiding place that would keep him safe from discovery, and every weakness in their home security that would allow him to disappear if they tried to trap him. The Hendersons installed security cameras throughout their house that weekend, hidden devices that would record any movement in the basement, kitchen, and main hallways, but their basement tenant was far more experienced at avoiding detection than they realized, and he had spent months learning the house's blind spots, the places where cameras couldn't see and footsteps couldn't be heard. What the cameras did capture was horrifying enough. Footage of someone moving through their kitchen at 2 a.m., opening the refrigerator and eating food directly from containers with his hands, drinking milk straight from the carton, and at 1 point, sitting at their kitchen table reading Sarah's personal mail while eating a sandwich made from their groceries. The figure on camera was thin and pale, with long, unwashed hair and clothes that hung loosely on his malnourished frame, but his movements were confident and familiar, someone who knew exactly where everything was kept, which floorboards creaked, and how to move through the house without disturbing the sleeping family upstairs. More disturbing than his presence was his behavior. He didn't just take what he needed and leave, he lingered, touching their belongings, sitting in their chairs, and at one point, standing at the bottom of the staircase for nearly 20 minutes, looking up toward the bedrooms where the family slept, as if he was considering whether to venture upstairs and make direct contact with his unwilling hosts. The cameras revealed that he had been in their house every single night since they moved in, sometimes for just an hour to gather food and supplies, other nights for 4 or 5 hours, treating their home like his personal sanctuary while they slept unaware just 1 floor above his head. David counted at least a dozen different hiding spots the intruder used throughout the house, behind the water heater, in the space above the basement ceiling tiles, inside a large cabinet in the basement workshop, and, most disturbing of all, in a hollow space behind the basement wall that he had carefully modified to create a room-sized hiding place that was invisible from the basement proper but provided access to the house's entire ventilation system. When David finally worked up the courage to explore this hidden room, he found what could only be described as a shrine to his family. Dozens of photographs taken without their knowledge, personal items that had gone missing over the past month, and a detailed journal documenting not just their routines but their personalities, their relationships, their fears and hopes as overheard through heating vents and thin walls, written by someone who had convinced himself that he was not an intruder, but a secret family member who deserved to be part of their lives, whether they wanted him there or not. The journal entries painted a picture of a man who had lost touch with reality months ago, someone who genuinely believed that living secretly in the basement of occupied homes was not just acceptable, but beneficial to the families he observed, convincing himself that he was a protective presence watching over them while they slept, a guardian angel who cleaned up small messes, fixed minor household problems, and ensured their safety through his vigilant observation. His writing revealed that the Henderson house was not his first such arrangement. He had been living this lifestyle for years, moving from empty house to empty house until families moved in, then staying as long as possible before circumstances forced him to relocate to a new basement, a new family, a new opportunity to live vicariously through other people's lives while remaining invisible and undetected. The most recent entries showed his growing frustration with the Hendersons' security measures, their cameras and door locks and alarm systems that made his nocturnal activities more challenging, but also his increasing determination to maintain his residency in their basement because he had grown genuinely attached to their family dynamics and considered their house his most comfortable long-term living situation. He wrote about Sarah's kindness in leaving leftover food in the refrigerator, not realizing she was simply storing dinner leftovers, and about David's generosity in leaving the basement door unlocked, not knowing that David simply forgot to lock it most evenings after taking laundry downstairs. Most disturbing were his detailed plans for revealing himself to the family, fantasies about emerging from hiding during a family dinner, and explaining that he had been living there all along, that he had been taking care of them and protecting them, and that they should welcome him as an official member of their household rather than calling the police or trying to force him to leave. The final journal entry, dated just 3 days before David found the hidden room, indicated that the man was planning to make contact soon because he was tired of hiding, tired of living like an animal in the basement, and convinced that the family would understand his situation and appreciate his months of silent guardianship once they got past the initial shock of discovering his presence. David realized that they were running out of time. This wasn't just a homeless person seeking shelter. It was someone who had built an entire delusional relationship with their family and was preparing to force that relationship into the open, regardless of how they felt about sharing their home with an uninvited permanent guest who had been watching their children sleep, studying their personal habits, and planning to become part of their lives whether they wanted him there or not. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday night when David decided he couldn't wait for the police to take their situation seriously and chose instead to confront their basement tenant directly, armed with a baseball bat and a cell phone ready, to call 911, not realizing that cornering a mentally unstable person who had spent months planning for exactly this scenario was the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. David waited until Sarah and the children were at her mother's house for the evening, then positioned himself in the basement around midnight, knowing from the camera footage that this was when their uninvited guest typically began his nightly activities. The man emerged from his hiding spot behind the false wall at 12:47 a.m., moving with his usual confidence until he noticed that the basement lights were on, and David was sitting calmly in a chair near the stairs, blocking the most direct route to the upper floors of the house. The stranger was smaller than he had appeared on camera, probably in his 30s but looking older due to malnutrition and poor hygiene, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was more frightened than dangerous. But when David spoke to him, asking him to leave peacefully and offering to help him find social services or a shelter, the man's response revealed just how detached from reality he had become. He insisted that this was his house, that he had been living there longer than the Henderson family, that he had every right to be there, and they were the intruders who had invaded his peaceful existence. He talked about how he had been taking care of them, protecting them from burglars and other dangers, keeping their house clean and organized while they were away, and how ungrateful they were to try to force him out after all he had done for them. As David tried to reason with him, explaining that this was legally their property and that he needed to find somewhere else to live, the man became increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth while muttering about how families never appreciated what he did for them, how they always turned against him just when he was ready to become a real part of their lives, how this always ended the same way with police and evictions and having to start over again with a new family who would eventually betray him too. When David stood up to leave and call the police, the man blocked his path to the stairs, no longer nervous but desperate, pleading with David to reconsider, to give him a chance to prove how valuable he could be as a permanent resident, to let him stay just a little longer because winter was coming and he had nowhere else to go. And David realized that this confrontation wasn't going to end with a peaceful resolution. It was going to end with violence, because this man had invested too much time and emotional energy in his delusional relationship with their family to simply walk away when asked to leave. Jake Martinez had been driving for 16 hours straight when he pulled into the Sunset Rest area somewhere along Interstate 80 in Nevada, a place that existed in the gap between civilization and the endless desert, where travelers stopped to stretch their legs and use facilities that were clean enough to be functional but remote. Enough that help was hours away if something went wrong. The rest stop appeared normal from the parking lot. A small building with restrooms and vending machines, a few picnic tables scattered around a patch of artificial grass, and the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly unreal, like a movie set designed to represent normalcy but missing some essential detail that would make it actually believable. Jake's cross-country move from his ex-wife's house in California to his new job in Chicago had been emotionally exhausting, and the late-night drive through empty desert highways had left him feeling disconnected from reality. So when he saw other vehicles in the parking lot and realized he wouldn't be alone at this remote facility, he felt a momentary relief that quickly transformed into something else when he got a closer look at his fellow travelers. There were 6 other people scattered around the rest area: an elderly couple sitting at one of the picnic tables sharing coffee from a thermos, a middle-aged woman in a business suit pacing back and forth while talking on her cell phone, a young man in his 20s sitting on the ground next to a motorcycle with his head in his hands, and 2 truck drivers who were standing near their rigs having what appeared to be an intense conversation about something that was clearly troubling them. What struck Jake as odd was that despite the variety of vehicles and the different types of people, they all seemed to be lingering at the rest area far longer than necessary, as if they were waiting for something or avoiding something. And when he walked past them toward the restroom building, he noticed that several of them looked at him with expressions that seemed more like pity than acknowledgement. The restroom building itself felt wrong the moment Jake stepped inside. The lights flickered constantly. There was a smell like copper pennies mixed with cleaning chemicals, and, most unsettling of all, there were dark stains on the floor near the sinks that looked like they had been scrubbed repeatedly but never completely removed. Stains that were too dark and too persistent to be anything innocent like spilled coffee or mud from travelers' boots. When Jake returned to the parking lot, the elderly couple approached him with a story that should have been his first warning to get back in his car and drive away as fast as possible. They claimed their car had broken down just as they arrived at the rest stop 3 hours ago. That their cell phones weren't getting signal to call for roadside assistance, and that they were hoping Jake might be able to give them a ride to the nearest town or at least help them figure out what was wrong with their vehicle. Their story was plausible enough, and Jake was naturally inclined to help fellow travelers in distress, but something about their demeanor felt rehearsed, like they had told this same story multiple times recently. And when he looked at their car, a well-maintained sedan that showed no obvious signs of mechanical problems, he noticed that the keys were still in the ignition and the gas tank appeared to be nearly full. The woman in the business suit joined their conversation, explaining that she had also experienced car trouble and had been stranded at the rest stop for nearly 2 hours, waiting for a tow truck that never arrived, and the young man with the motorcycle claimed that his bike had started making strange noises just as he pulled into the rest area, and he was afraid to continue riding it until he could get it checked by a mechanic. The truck drivers, who had initially seemed to be having their own private conversation, gradually moved closer to Jake's group and began sharing similar stories of mechanical failures that had all occurred at exactly the same time they arrived at this particular rest stop, creating a situation where 7 different vehicles had all experienced problems simultaneously in the middle of nowhere, stranding their occupants together in a place where cell phone service was spotty and the nearest town was 40 miles away in any direction. Jake's instincts were screaming that something was wrong with this scenario. The odds of so many different mechanical failures happening at once were essentially impossible, and the way the other travelers kept glancing at each other when they thought he wasn't looking suggested some kind of coordination or shared knowledge that they weren't sharing with him. When Jake suggested that they should all work together to get at least one vehicle running so someone could drive to town for help, the group exchanged looks that confirmed his suspicions. These people weren't stranded travelers waiting for rescue. They were predators who had been using this remote rest stop as a hunting ground, and Jake had just identified himself as their next target by stopping at the wrong place at the wrong time during his lonely cross-country drive. The realization that he was surrounded by people who meant him harm hit Jake like a physical blow when he walked back to his car and discovered that someone had punctured 2 of his tires while he was talking to the group. ensuring that he couldn't simply drive away from whatever they had planned for him. The elderly couple was no longer maintaining their friendly facade. They were watching him from beside their supposedly broken-down sedan with expressions of cold calculation, and the woman in the business suit had stopped pacing and was now standing between Jake and the restroom building, cutting off his most obvious escape route if he tried to run into the desert on foot. The young man with the motorcycle had produced a knife from somewhere and was casually cleaning his fingernails with it while humming a tune that sounded like a children's lullaby, and the two truck drivers had moved their vehicles to block the rest area's exit ramps, making it clear that Jake wasn't going to be driving out of there even if his tires had been intact. Jake's cell phone showed no signal, which he now realized wasn't due to the remote location but because someone had set up equipment to jam communications in the area, a level of planning and preparation that suggested this group had been operating out of this rest stop for quite some time, preying on solo travelers who made the mistake of stopping for what they thought would be a quick bathroom break or snack from the vending machines. The rest area's attendant booth, which should have been staffed even during overnight hours, was dark and appeared to have been empty for some time, and when Jake looked more closely at the building, he could see signs of damage that looked like it had been deliberately vandalized. Broken windows that had been covered with plywood, doors that were secured with chains rather than standard locks, and what appeared to be bullet holes in the concrete walls near the employee entrance. Jake understood with horrible clarity that he had stumbled into a trap that had been set for months or possibly years, a carefully orchestrated operation where a group of killers had taken control of a remote rest area and were using it to prey on travelers who were far from help, tired from long drives, and vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack that was about to unfold unless Jake could find a way to escape into the desert darkness before these people decided it was time to stop pretending to be stranded motorists and reveal their true, yet intentions. The attack came at 3:30 a.m. when the group apparently decided that Jake had seen too much and was too suspicious to continue the pretense of being fellow travelers in distress, and what followed was a desperate chase through the desert landscape surrounding the rest area as Jake ran for his life while being pursued by 6 people who had clearly done this before and knew exactly how to hunt a human being across open ground in the darkness. Jake's only advantage was that he was younger and more physically fit than most of his pursuers, and his terror gave him an adrenaline boost that allowed him to maintain a lead even though he was running blind across unfamiliar terrain filled with rocks, cacti, and holes that could break an ankle if he stepped wrong. The truck drivers had flashlights and were trying to coordinate the search by radio, directing the others to spread out and surround Jake's most likely hiding spots, but the desert at night was full of shadows and natural cover that allowed him to stay ahead of them as long as he kept moving and didn't make noise that would give away his position. Jake could hear them calling to each other as they searched, their voices carrying clearly in the dry air, and what he heard confirmed that this was not their first victim. They talked about previous kills with casual familiarity, discussed the best places to dispose of bodies where they wouldn't be found for years, and debated whether to make Jake's death quick or take their time with him since he had provided them with more entertainment than most travelers by actually trying to escape instead of simply accepting his fate. The elderly couple had returned to the rest area to watch the access roads in case Jake circled back to try to reach one of the vehicles, while the woman in the business suit and the young man with the knife continued tracking him through the desert, following his footprints in the sand and calling out taunts about how far he thought he could run before exhaustion or dehydration forced him to give up and surrender. Jake realized that his only chance was to reach the highway and flag down a passing vehicle, but the rest area was positioned deliberately far from the main road, connected by a long access road that would leave him exposed and visible to his pursuers for several minutes before he could reach potential help from other travelers, and the killers had clearly planned for this possibility because they were systematically cutting off his routes toward the highway while forcing him deeper into the desert where no one would ever think to look for his body. Around 4 a.m., Jake found temporary shelter behind a large boulder formation about 2 miles from the rest area, close enough that he could still see the lights of the facility but far enough that he had a few minutes to catch his breath and try to formulate a plan that didn't end with his death in this godforsaken stretch of Nevada desert. He could hear the searchers moving through the darkness around him, their flashlight beams sweeping back and forth as they methodically checked every hiding spot, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they found his location and finished what they had started when they disabled his car and revealed their true nature. Jake's best hope was to wait until just before dawn, when the killers might assume he had either died of exposure or managed to escape far enough that he was no longer their problem, then make a final desperate run toward the highway during the confusion of sunrise, when their night vision would be compromised and he might have a chance to reach the road before they could stop him. What Jake didn't know, and what he wouldn't discover until the sun finally began to rise over the desert horizon, was that this rest area had been the site of dozens of disappearances over the past 3 years, that the group hunting him had perfected their system through practice on other solo travelers who had made the same fatal mistake of stopping at the wrong place during late-night drives across empty highways, and that the reason no authorities had ever investigated the pattern of missing persons was because the killers had connections within the local law enforcement community, who helped cover up their activities in exchange for a share of whatever valuables their victims carried, making this stretch of desert highway a killing field where predators could hunt human prey with complete impunity, as long as they were careful to choose victims who wouldn't be missed immediately and whose disappearances could be explained away. As people who simply decided to start new lives somewhere else rather than victims of a coordinated murder operation that had been running successfully for years. TEC. Dawn broke over the Nevada desert at 6:23 a.m., painting the landscape in shades of gold and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But for Jake Martinez, sunrise meant the difference between life and death as he made his final desperate sprint toward the highway, while his pursuers, exhausted from hours of hunting, made one last coordinated effort to prevent his escape from their carefully constructed killing ground. The woman in the business suit had positioned herself near the highway access road, but her night vision was compromised by the sudden brightness, and Jake managed to slip past her position by staying low and using the morning shadows cast by roadside vegetation to mask his movement toward the main road. The truck drivers were still searching the area around the rest area, convinced that Jake was hiding somewhere nearby rather than making a run for freedom, and by the time they realized their mistake, Jake was already climbing over the highway guardrail and frantically waving his arms at an approaching 18-wheeler whose driver, fortunately, was alert enough to recognize a person in genuine distress rather than someone trying to set up a roadside ambush. The truck driver, a woman named Carol who had been driving long-haul routes for 15 years and had seen enough strange situations to trust her instincts about danger, didn't hesitate to radio for help when Jake collapsed in her cab and told her about the rest area killers, and within 2 hours, state police had surrounded the facility and arrested the entire group before they could scatter to new hunting grounds. The investigation that followed revealed that Jake had been the intended 13th victim of what authorities called the Sunset Rest Area murders, a killing spree that had claimed 12 previous travelers over 3 years, with bodies buried in unmarked graves throughout the surrounding desert, and personal effects sold through various channels to fund the group's continued operation. The rest area attendant had been their first victim, killed when he stumbled onto their operation and tried to call for help, and his booth had been converted into a communication center where they monitored police radio frequencies and coordinated their attacks on unsuspecting travelers who stopped for what they thought would be a safe rest break during long desert drives. Jake's testimony, combined with evidence found at the rest area and the recovery of personal effects from previous victims, led to multiple murder convictions for all 6 killers, but the case left him with permanent psychological scars and a healthy paranoia about stopping at remote facilities during late-night drives because he learned the hard way that predators exist everywhere, even in places that are supposed to represent safety and civilization along America's highways. These 3 stories, pulled from the deepest corners of Reddit's true horror communities, remind us that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding under our beds or lurking in haunted houses. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, in empty office buildings where security guards disappear without explanation, in basement crawl spaces beneath suburban homes where families sleep unaware of their uninvited guests, and at roadside rest areas where weary travelers expect to Find safety, but instead discover that some journeys end in unmarked graves scattered across endless stretches of desert sand. Subscribe if you dare to hear more stories like these, because the darkness is full of tales that are far more frightening than any fiction writer could imagine. And somewhere out there, new stories are being written every night by people who survive encounters with the kind of evil that most of us never want to believe exists in our ordinary world.